And then if we break down these 3 dimensions further on, we start by looking at these, what we call internal silos, right? In some other ways, I like to call this an organizational chaos. So I have worked with over 100 companies in this particular aspect. And it's really a chaotic time of the year, right? It's a chaotic process trying to understand, first of all, what data you need, and then going after people in different departments can be quite brutal. So I do and empathize with anyone here. But ultimately, as you can see on the left, right, when you do have a sustainability team, which is not always the case, it's important to remember the maturity of a business. Sometimes you have someone in procurement dealing with sustainability, or you have finance dealing with sustainability as well. Only then, with a certain maturity, you'll have a sustainability team. So the role in this means that I like to see sustainability, let's say, professionals as translators, right? Because in the beginning, they have to really split themselves into many different roles, trying to get particular information that most often than not is in mismatched formats. And it's really complicated to reconcile into a particular system that you're working with, for example. So this whole task becomes a actual nightmare whenever you happen to go and think about, oh, it's time to report again, right? So when talking to these sustainability professionals over time, what I've seen is that quite a lot of them spend most of their time in data collection processes. That gets repeated once, maybe twice a year, depending on how you report. But ultimately, if you think about it, this is a manual process that in theory should be better off handled with better infrastructure, right? So let's keep this in mind. Now, if we go on the second approach, a different dimension is this external complexity, right? So if you think about, okay, if I only need to get information from within my business, that's one thing. But if you do sustainability reporting, especially carbon accounting, you will need data from outside of your business. And then, of course, it adds up a layer of complexity. If you think about supply chains, you have to deal with getting to the supplier, hoping that they actually track some data, if they do manage it somehow. Utilities and service providers, again, all providing different formats. You may or may not have subdivisions or other entities, franchises, joint ventures. So all bringing in different dynamics, different complexities, because most often than not, probably the same tool might not be used in all of the entities, all of the businesses. Then you have customers perhaps with certain particular demands and requirements. Again, more transparency on a couple of topics, traceability, which is now a big topic within sustainable supply chains, for example. And like I said, with portfolio companies, right? So if you add this complexity to already a very demanding task, it's quite brutal. And last but not least, the source gap that I mentioned earlier, right? So every player that I've mentioned in this crazy, let's say, pyramid of players, most likely they'll give you a report in a particularly different format that actually you need. So you'll need some time yourself to break that apart and put it in a format that either you can accept or a system that you're working with can accept. And then this is where this gap creates, right? So when you have a source gap, as we call it, to the report, and you cannot really trace it, it's really where this trust starts to break down, right? And ultimately, traceability, especially in sustainability reporting, is very important. And then if you cannot really defend it, you're under scrutiny, right? So it's a complicated situation to be in, right? So especially, let's take one example in this particular case. If you've calculated scope 3 before, you will understand that indeed is It's one of the most complex challenges in sustainability reporting and carbon accounting specifically. And if you take one of those categories into account, perhaps purchased goods, you'll see that there are different players in this dimension, yes? You'll see that you'll be interacting with purchasing data, with procurement. You'll need transportation data that sits with the logistics, if you have a department of it. You have spend data that again sits with finance. You'll need particular emission factors, either supplier-specific ones if you want to be that granular, or just state emission factors. And then you'll need your time to normalize and validate all of that, right? So for one particular calculation that ideally should go smoothly, you're talking about 3 different internal departments from your organization. You're talking about multiple external complexities, again, and perhaps 5 different formats all along the way. So all of this complexity is really something that it's important to keep in mind when we say data and reporting, right? So one thing that I want you to keep in mind, and especially as Najd goes a bit in detail on this on the next few slides, is that consider these 3 dimensions that we discussed, right? So functions that don't really own the data, organizations that you don't really control, and then environments that are not designed for reporting. All of this put you in a sensitive position. And how best to treat this is really changing this notion, this mindset that reporting in itself is not the constraint and should not be the goal, right? Like Farouk said, report is just that final output. And what should be really a priority is understanding how you improve processes in order to achieve that, right? So how can you focus on the upstream side of your work so that the downstream feels more efficient and easier for you, right?